I recently talked to John Reitz, managing editor of the Gwinnett Daily News, a suburban newspaper in the Atlanta, Georgia area with a circulation of 50,000. The Gwinnett Daily News is part of the New York Times regional newspaper group. In 1988, when it became a daily, it was the fastest growing daily in the United States. And I asked him, what is the most important thing for church communicators to remember when they prepare a news story? And here's what he had to say.
I believe the most important thing is to remember that you're competing for the editor's attention. Most city editors and metro editors are opening the mail and looking at dozens of press releases each day, and at a paper our size we get 200 to 300 press releases daily in the mail, and it's just a matter of sheer volume. The important thing to remember when you're preparing your press release is to be straight to the point. Don't use flowery language or overworked verbs. Put the facts on the piece of paper and give the editor the information that he or she needs to proceed in preparing it for publication in the newspaper. Handle basically the who, what, why, when, and wheres as quickly as possible.
Who, what, why, when, and where. And that brings us to the lead, the most important part of a news story. But first, we need to look at how a news story is different from other kinds of stories. A news story is not structured like a short story or a biography. If I were to draw a picture of the structure of a short story or a mystery, it would probably look like this, a pyramid. The tiny point at the top means that the information given at the beginning of the story is in tiny bits, disconnected but interesting. Gradually, as the story unfolds, the little bits of information get bigger and more important until finally the last major event occurs. The last piece of the puzzle falls into place and the complete story is understood. The purpose of this kind of story is to keep you interested until the last word of the book, short story, or magazine article. But the purpose of a news story is not to keep you in suspense until the end. It's just the opposite, to give you a big picture right up front, and that's done in the lead paragraph. To write a lead paragraph, ask yourself these questions: who, what, where, when, why, and how. Answering these 5 W's and 1 H will enable you to write a good lead paragraph for your news story. Not all the questions may be relevant or valuable to your story, so you don't have to answer them all. But if you don't answer most of them, your paragraph won't be a true lead, and your article probably won't be a good news story. Let's look at a couple of examples.
The Pine Street Seventh-day Adventist Church announced plans yesterday to build a community services center at 2107 Pine Street. The center will house supplies for clothing and food distribution. Does this paragraph do what it should? Does it tell who? The Pine Street Seventh-day Adventist Church. What? Announced plans to build a community services center. Where? 2107 Pine Street. When? Yesterday. Why? To house supplies for clothing and food distribution. How? Well, it doesn't really answer that question, does it? How the building is constructed is not really important in this case. But let's say the method of construction was important. Let's say Maranatha Volunteers International was planning to construct the building in 1 day. Then the how might become the most important part of the story. Perhaps 2 stories could be written about the project. One when the announcement is made focusing on what, and another focusing on how. The how story could start like this. The new Pine Street Seventh-day Adventist Community Services Center was completely enclosed in 18 hours yesterday. Volunteer workers from all over the country participated. Workers began erecting walls at 5 a.m. on a concrete slab poured last week. By 11 p.m., the building was dried in. In this case, all the questions are answered except why, which could be dealt with later in the article, along with an explanation of who Maranatha Volunteers International is, what the purpose of the center will be, how this fits into the Seventh-day Adventist philosophy, and so on.
By the way, be sure to double-check all statistics, dates, and other information to verify that they are correct. An article with incorrect information will embarrass you and result in a loss of credibility. So a lead gives all the basic information: who, what, where, when, why, and how, and succeeding paragraphs fill in with less and less important information. Do you know why a news story has to be constructed that way? Well, let me show you. Here is the way a newspaper story looks when the type has been set. This is called a galley proof. Newspapers which don't paste up by computer use a galley proof to do final proofreading before the story is sized and placed on the page. But suppose there isn't enough space for all of this copy. Well, other stories are just as important and deserve to be included in today's edition as well. What must the editor do? He cuts the last part of the article, and those last paragraphs never see the light of day. So now you see why it's necessary to have a good lead and your most important information toward the beginning of your article. Besides, most readers are busy. Even if the newspaper prints everything you wrote, there is no guarantee that the reader will have the time to read your entire article. So you need to hook them up front. Now, there are two other types of newspaper stories which you should know about: the feature and the column. The feature is a story which is written to attract interest and entertain the reader, as well as convey information. It's not shaped like a pyramid or an inverted pyramid. It's shaped more like a box. A feature will convey both very important and less important information throughout the article, and may use a theme or play on words to give the beginning and the ending paragraphs some bite, causing the reader to chuckle or do a double take. A feature is also usually not a late-breaking story, but may be written over several days or even weeks. Column is useful to your church if your paper accepts regular columns by clergy and your pastor wants to write one. This is a useful way to keep your church before the community and allow your pastor to become known. Or a layman may wish to write a column on behalf of the church. The subject does not have to be devotional. It could be health. The General Conference produces a weekly column called Healthwise. These timely articles provide you with a presence in your paper without having to write anything. Many papers will run Healthwise free as a public service. But let's get back to news, since that's what you will be doing 95% of the time. You've selected your event. You've evaluated it as to news value. You've written a good lead and completed the story. To whom should you take it at your paper? Let's ask John Reitz, managing editor of the Gwinnett Daily News.
That varies depending upon the size of the newspaper. Generally, the larger papers have a separate religion editor with several additional writers. Smaller papers may have a religion person assigned to handle religion news who does other duties. When in doubt, ask for the city editor or the metro editor. Those are the two editors who are generally responsible for working with the local reporters. It's fine to go ahead and ask initially for the religion editor, but generally at smaller papers you'll find that there may not be a religion editor. It may be a religion reporter who works under the supervision of the city editor. Know ahead of time who you're dealing with at the newspaper. That's very important, and direct the press release to a specific person. Try to avoid sending the press release in to the city editor or the metro editor or the religion editor without a name attached to it, because newspapers are like any office. The mail doesn't necessarily get to the right person when it's not addressed to the specific individual.
Seventh-day Adventist churches conduct community services which fall into the area of health. Would those items also go to the religion editor?
Those kinds of items generally, I believe, would fall in another category. And that depends upon each individual paper, of course, and their philosophy and how they handle news and the amount of space they have to devote to various items. But for example, at our paper, we have a health and fitness section each week. And if And if your church has an event that really is more of a health and awareness, fitness type program that would be of benefit in that area, that it would be our preference to put that on the health and fitness page, to put it in a health and fitness calendar. Our paper and many other papers are heavily into running agate, small type listings of calendar events, of specific events coming up, and an item like that would fit perfectly in a health and fitness calendar at a paper like this, or any other paper that happens to follow that philosophy. It makes more sense than, in our opinion, than placing it on the religion pages alone, because you're looking for a general audience concerned about health and fitness section is a proper place for that.
After a communication leader has written an article, what's the next step?
Well, we would recommend, and we do recommend to the people that we work with, that they call first and find out what our needs are and our requirements and our requests in submitting press releases. We like to have the initial contact. It makes it a little bit easier to build a relationship and work with people as time goes by. We request, for example, that people submitting press releases always put their phone number, address, name, and perhaps a secondary phone number in the upper left-hand corner of the press release. Try to keep it confined to one page, simply because of the volume of press releases that are moving through the office each day. And try to keep it just as brief and informative as possible. And the most important thing is to provide phone numbers for additional information. It's also a good idea, if you have an event that you think is newsworthy from a photo standpoint, to provide additional information, perhaps at the bottom of the press release, about photo contacts.
Ah, I was going to ask about photography. What kind of pictures do you prefer?
Universally, I think most papers would want a black and white. All newspapers, or most newspapers, have the capability to take a color picture and run it as a black and white, but you lose a lot in the translation, and it is much better to have a black and white. A good clear black and white is what you want. If you don't have that, a very good color photo that doesn't have strong reds and oranges and things like that, kind of a neutral color photo will generally work also.
Could you comment on the importance of deadlines?
Deadlines vary from paper to paper, but the important thing to remember in working with the daily newspaper is that there's an incredible volume of copy that flows into that newspaper, and though it is a daily newspaper, much of it is produced in advance as much as possible or earlier in the day. Not everything happens on a morning newspaper between the hours of 4 p.m. and 1 a.m. Our religion pages are produced, and most religion pages on morning newspapers are produced the morning prior, or perhaps even the day prior to publication. So it is important to give lead time and know the deadline that your local newspaper adheres to. Most newspapers have little flexibility in dealing with deadlines. They are moving many pages daily, and they have to follow those deadlines. The best thing to do is check with your local paper and see when they prefer that your copy be submitted. As soon as you know about an event coming up that you think is newsworthy, you should go ahead and let the paper know, even as far out as a month. Most papers keep day books or planning books. City desks keep planning books. Religion editors keep planning books. And if they're doing their job properly, they'll take your press release if they think it might be something worth following up on a little closer to the event or covering with a photo or a reporter. They'll put it in their day book, and they will already have notice of it and can be making their plans. So in that sense, it is better to let the paper know as soon as possible what's going on.